Welcome back to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. We're going to resume our conversation with Sam Roggeveen. It's been really fascinating to get your perspective on this because it has challenged a lot of commentary that's out there at the moment. And what we're hoping to do is equip you with the ability to go away and make your own judgments on these things. But we'll move in now. We want to finish off this conversation about how China is conducting its other activities in pursuit of its interests. And then to talk about the Trump factor, which was, I guess, a new aspect of this issue that came out kind of like post the book originally. And then what Sam suggests is the way forward for Australia, what we should be doing, as opposed to some of the conversations that have been around the hardware of the military sphere. So, Sam, welcome back again, and thanks very much for sticking with us.
Thanks.
And look, one of the things that bothers me a lot is I hear your point about the robustness of the democracy and freedom is important, but I think there is an issue here in that one of the things we've seen is the way that China and Russia and Iran, etc., have exploited both the developing world and its relationship with the West, and we see that is being challenged right now and deteriorating, and the rise of autocracies, etc., which is affecting the way the UN operates too. So that global order that we have an interest in, Australia's foreign policy has always been focused on multilateralism and institutions like the United Nations as a middle power where our interests lie. But so there's that aspect of it, and then the other aspect is the way they're corroding our young and their minds through TikTok, etc. And there's been a couple of really poignant examples of that. One is the referendum on the voice to the Parliament, where the community's attitudes started out around the 64% mark in favour. In the course of the campaign, disintegrated. And I remember hearing an ABC journalist interview with someone coming out of a polling booth at the time, and the journalist said, do you mind me asking you how you voted? And this bloke says, I voted no. And the journalist says to him, well, can I ask you why you voted no? And he sort of said A, B, and C. And the journalist said, well, that's all wrong. It was X, Y, and Z. So this bloke says, I should have voted yes. So the journalist says, well, where'd you get your information? He says, TikTok. And there was a lot of really poisonous material that came out on TikTok at the time that was highly sort of crafted disinformation. Fine for people to make up their minds on that issue if they were well informed, but there was a lot of misinformation coming out. And then I see like the current situation in the Middle East. You had, demonstrations on campuses that started out as understandably looking for peace and ceasefires. Then it morphed into, no, let's have a wider war and destroy Israel. And then it became, let's boycott Israeli companies. And then it became, let's boycott any activity of any Australian company or any other company that's working on our national security. And so you ask yourself the question of who does that benefit? And we know, and I've done a lot of deep dives on these kinds of campaigns that start out working on some basis of facts and concern and then steer you in particular directions. So China, I know, has been very active in many aspects of this, and they have also been very interventionary with the Chinese community, although you note that the Chinese community is kind of aware of this. But also in intervening in financial ways to try and influence our politics and the like. So do you have any thoughts about how we counter this beyond the hope that our democracy is robust enough to withstand it?
Well, I guess where I would begin is in asking about the effectiveness of those kind of campaigns. I know you mentioned in our previous episode the Russian campaign during the US elections of 2016. And I'm aware that there's a lot of discussion in the US about just how effective that campaign was. It was certainly clear that there was one, particularly around Facebook. But whether it influenced a lot of votes is really an open question. And so my starting point would, for the Australian context as well, would be, well, how well is this working? And I've also, I think, got a reasonable amount of faith in the good sense of Australians to spot a fake. Now, that's getting harder, of course, and some people will be influenced, but, it requires an awfully successful information campaign to swing entire elections. It's possible, of course, but again, I've got a great, well, not just a good deal of faith in this good sense of Australians, but actually in the robustness of our political institutions to withstand that kind of pressure. And that's in no way to be kind of complacent about this. And I think there's definitely a role for our security agencies and our public broadcaster and other institutions to play a role in countering this kind of disinformation. At the heart of this actually is a question of the authority of information sources. Like which information sources do Australians, do Western publics writ large actually trust anymore? In the pre-internet age, information was held tightly by a small number of very large institutions, whether that was the news media institutions or whether it's governments, financial institutions, the legal establishment, the scientific establishment, etc. Small number of, highly prestigious bodies. The problem that's been created by the explosion of information that we now have, like we're all this daily tidal wave of information coming at us, is that it undermines all those institutions, right? When those institutions no longer have a monopoly on information, then they lose their authority. So those institutions suddenly cease to look like they are the font of wisdom.
Yes.
That is a major problem, is how do you sustain the authority of institutions in an age where we are being overwhelmed by data and by information?
Yes, I guess we're fortunate that we weren't as vulnerable as the US in that in the end, because I've done a deep dive on this, but in the end all that the Russians needed to do was influence 70,000 voters in the United States, because they really distilled things through the useful tool they had of Cambridge Analytica, etc., of identifying persuadables in key places because of the electoral college system, because of the fact they don't have compulsory voting, etc., these sorts of things. But fortunately here we do have compulsory voting, and we don't have an electoral college, and so you've got to be picking on marginal seats and the right booths in the marginal seats. Right. And I did see some evidence of that in our 2019 campaign, actually, because I had a lot of very diverse booths, and you could see the booths that were targeted by these techniques in social media, and counterintuitively in some ways, but understanding who they were going after and having an impact from where we started to where we finished. But, we still got over the line. And I know the Chinese were very interested in our last federal election and did weigh in very heavily, systematically. They've wanted to see a Labor win, frankly. But in the end, I think there were a lot of dynamics that came into play there, so it may not have been so significant.
Yes. That may have been the T word intervening there in our election, which I know we're going to get onto as well.
Trump and the bad campaign the coalition ran, and the fact that Labor course corrected in addressing the cost of living issues and the domestic security stuff. So it all washes out sometimes, but it's as you say, it's something we've got to keep on our toes about.
Right.
But so that does move us to the Trump factor, less reliable. I know you actually were already saying in your book that the US may not be reliable in this situation. So now that's looking like it's on steroids. It's like sort of unpredictable, although Trump has wielded the tariff axe on China, which I think may have actually been quite useful, given that China wielded it against us and might have pulled them up short about, hey, like this can deliver you some short-term pain as well, maybe even long-term. So what's your view now of Trump having arrived rather than being in prospect?
Yeah, well, the steroids metaphor is not a bad one. The way I've described it in the past is that I think Trump is an accelerant of existing trends rather than a break with trends in American foreign policy and politics. And in the Asia Pacific, I think the trend is clearest when you look at America's military posture since the end of the Cold War. So since the end of the Cold War, and the reason to date it from there is 1991 is really when the modernization of China's military began in earnest. Right, that was the year that the Americans pushed Saddam out of Kuwait, and the Chinese watched that from afar and got an almighty shock. They realized they were still fielding a sort of Stalinist type military machine.
Yes. Sort of old Russia here.
Yeah, and the Iraqis, in relative terms, were actually more advanced than the Chinese were at that time,
Right.
and they got massacred by the Americans, who lost a handful of people in a hugely successful campaign. So the Chinese got the shock of their lives and said, right, we're going to have to modernize our military quick, fast. And they did. And it succeeded, beyond any reasonable expectation, really. And what has the United States done in that same period, in that same 30-something year period since 1991? Not very much. So its military posture in the Asia Pacific is roughly the same as it was in 1991. Similar number of troops when you add up the troops in Japan and in South Korea. There's still one carrier battle group based in Japan, 4 fighter wings based in Korea. There's the Pacific Command headquarters in Hawaii. Guam has expanded a little bit. There are more submarines there now than there used to be, but that's about it. Other than that, the forces in the region have modernized, certainly, but they haven't expanded.
Right.
And so that ought to be a signal to Australia. In fact, my argument in the book is that should be a very strong signal to Australia, that despite all the rhetoric, especially over the last 3 administrations, Trump 1, Biden, and then now Trump 2, the rhetoric is that China is now the pacing threat. China is the major strategic competitor to America. Fine, but nothing has substantially changed. Right? American military force posture in Asia has not expanded significantly. There are some people in this Trump administration who are saying that it will change. These are the so-called prioritizers who want to pull back from Europe, pull back from the Middle East, and put all those forces in Asia. There's just no evidence of it happening yet. So my argument is Australia needs to get the message. The Americans are not actually committed to this, and for good reason. I don't blame them. For good reason, they are not committed to maintaining their strategic leadership in Asia. And what does that mean for Australia? We have to do much more for ourselves.
Yeah. And I guess the rhetoric from Trump has been, and what helped win him the election, was he's going to be effectively an isolationist and not commit to new wars. I mean, we can isolate the 12 days in Iran because it was just a strike, and it was a remote strike, or very remote, coming from Missouri, basically. But no one was at risk because the Israelis had done all the heavy lifting and taken all the risk. So it suited Trump perfectly. But
And when you hear Trump himself talk about American security, he doesn't talk about NATO or about the Middle East. He talks about Canada, Greenland, Panama.
And taking them.
The Mexican border.
Right.
The Golden Dome. What is the Golden Dome? It's a missile defense shield to protect the continental United States. Right? It's not about protecting allies.
Right.
And for instance, when Trump talks about Ukraine a few months ago, he used this phrase. He said, well, Ukraine is really Europe's problem, not ours, because we're separated by a big, beautiful ocean. Well, consult an atlas, because Australia and the rest of Asia, they're separated from America by a big, beautiful ocean too.
Yeah.
Right?
It seems that, I mean, if you were betting, I guess the mercurial nature of Trump makes that interesting, but the inclination seems to be fairly clear. But what contradicts that then is you get this recent activity where the Americans are saying to Australia, like, you have to be open in public that, you'd back us in and you'd support us if we went to war over Taiwan, which is like flying in the face of the American strategy that has been strategic ambiguity in the first place.
That's right, yes.
And so what should be the Australian response to that prod?
Yep. And there's clear divergences among the senior advisors to Trump on this point. So Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, gave a speech at the Shangri-La Security Dialogue about a month ago in Singapore, in which he made American support for Taiwan pretty unambiguous and clear. But I mean, I ask myself, and I ask lots of people, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this actually, Mike. Do you think President Trump himself believes that he would come to Taiwan's defense? Would he fight China over Taiwan? I really don't think so.
No, I think he really sees China more as a competitor. This is a bit of a common theme in America. They tend to see things as a competition rather than, well, how do you find the mutual interest and what will benefit each of us sort of thing. And it is interesting. There is a lot of intertwining with China and America. China owns a fair bit of America's debt, and the Silk Road and Silicon Valley were kind of joined at the hip, there's been a bit of delinking, going on of that. And I think the key interest for everybody was TSMC in Taiwan, because 90% of the world's advanced and, and 90% of its contracted microchips comes out of TSMC. But Biden introduced, the CHIP Act and whatnot, and they're trying to, build the alternative to that. Both getting TSMC to set up facilities in the US, but also getting the free world semiconductor crew together and cooperate on creating an alternative, because we saw what happened with COVID and what an impact that had on the global economy, of the supply chain disruption. So I guess Trump is always looking at things through that prism of the deal. And so what's your leverage and what points of cajoling that he can use, in terms of things like the blunt instrument of the tariff and whatnot. So,
I mean, I definitely agree that Trump is interested in competition with China. I just don't think military competition interests him at all. I think it's economic competition.
Right. I think that's right. Although it's hard to say. It depends on who he's spoken to last.
Yeah, that could be right.
And what he wakes up with that morning.
Yeah.
But that then brings us to the Australian options. In managing this relationship with China, which is so important economically. And we've seen Prime Minister Albanese's visit there to China. And in your book, you got some interesting suggestions or priorities that you have set out in there. And the number one priority you've marked out is the relationship with Indonesia. So could you describe how you see that playing out? Or what direction should that new surge take?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reason to emphasize Indonesia firstly is that it's built on quite a simple logic of, foreign policy realism, which is that alliances are ultimately built on shared vital interests. And so one of the big themes of the book is that the United States no longer has vital security interests, not so important that they would be willing to fight China over, right? America's a very secure country. And even though it likes being top dog in Asia, that's not important enough that it would fight China to remain top dog. So in those circumstances, as I said earlier, we've got to do more for ourselves. And we've got to find partners who share those vital interests with us. And to me, the best candidate is Indonesia because of our shared geography. So the one key thing that I think Australia and Indonesia have in common is that neither of us want to see maritime Southeast Asia dominated by China. I don't think there's any question China is going to be a leading or the leading power in Asia, including in Southeast Asia, but it doesn't have to be the dominant power. It's within the power of Australia and with Indonesian help to stop China from ever dominating. And that, to me, is the basis of a very close partnership, something I would say is akin to an alliance. I don't think it'll ever be called an alliance because the Indonesians are very skittish about that kind of thing.
And then tradition and non-alliance.
Yeah, exactly. And actually one of the problems that we have here is that, Indonesia has sort of failed to shed that Cold War skin of non-alignment. Not the non-alignment posture is really a vestige of the Cold War. It's just not terribly relevant anymore. But they hang on to it as a core part of their strategic identity.
Gives you leverage too if you're setting off powers competing with each other over your interests.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I guess what I'm counting on, what I hope for is, that's the wrong way of putting it. But what I expect in the future is that China's ambitions are going to butt up against Indonesia's interests so strongly that the Indonesians will kind of be forced into taking a more stronger position. And when that moment arrives, Australia should be ready, right? Because Indonesia, by the middle of this century, is going to be a great power.
Mm-hmm.
Its economy will be perhaps in the top 5 in the world in terms of sheer size. So that's a country worth being on the right side of.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, for all of the worry that we hear now in the national conversation about China and its security impact on Australia, I would say that the impact of an Indonesia that is both powerful and hostile to Australia, that would be a far worse situation than we're in now with regard to China. China's rise is very much manageable for Australia if we play our cards right. But an Indonesia that is A, very wealthy, and B, hostile to Australia, that would be a disaster for us in security terms. So that's something we should be working very hard to avoid.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen some really demonstrably warm relationship there in the leadership terms between Australia and Indonesia. But we've always failed to kind of build this out more deeply. There is quite a bit of, like people-to-people stuff goes on, but it's not very systematic. And one of the things I was looking at one point was how we might, I know from experience working with regional colleagues in the militaries, is that they are very comfortable in that kind of UN space, and they all started developing peacekeeping centres at one point when peacekeeping was a bit on the surge and everything. So Blue Helmet world is something they're okay with. And I often thought, well, maybe what we could do, as they did in South America, to sort of diffuse the military problems that pose for democracies there, is to set up these, regional contributions to the UN and collaborative enterprises between South American states, and that we could perhaps look at maybe setting up some sort of combined unit structure, small to begin with, and maybe build it out a bit as a regional UN peacekeeping offering, or at least standby capability, because that's kind of been a bit overtaken by events in the way the UN's kind of deteriorated as an institution, and peacekeeping's kind of gone off the boil. But are there other ways you see through which we can build the relationship, the dialogue, so that there's a foundation for having that kind of strategic collaboration, the comfort that might be there for that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think you're right to say that the relationship at the political level is very good right now. In fact, it may be as close as it's ever been. And it's worth adding, actually, I think this surprises people when they hear it, that Australia's largest embassy in the world is in Jakarta. So that's a significant, symbolic commitment that Australia has made to that relationship.
Got to be a good relationship if someone's calling Albo good looking.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. But look, there are a couple of specific things I'd point to that can lay the kind of groundwork that you're talking about. One is that there's barely an Indonesian diaspora in Australia. That is a strange artifact, because Australia has been so open to immigrants from Asia for so long now that it's weird that barely any of them are Indonesians. In fact, there's many more Thais and Vietnamese in Australia than there are Indonesians. So I think, just as a small measure to add some ballast to the relationship, Australia could create visa categories that make it easier for Indonesians to emigrate to Australia. And it's not as if Indonesians are shy about immigration. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of them in Taiwan, for instance, not to mention in the Gulf states as well. So Indonesians are very keen immigrants, and I think that could form a basis for a much more sustainable relationship with Australia. I guess the other thing I'd point to is on the defence side is maritime cooperation, because ultimately, the logic of the argument that I was making before about the common perception of a China threat, this is a maritime threat, right? We share, Indonesia and Australia share a maritime theatre, and it's in our interest to make sure that China never dominates that maritime theatre. And so that is where I would be concentrating Australian military diplomatic efforts, is on enhancing and improving Indonesia's ability to control its maritime space.
Right. And in the time we have left, then parking the Indonesian priority, very sound actually, whatever happens, whatever objectives we got. I mean, it's just an obvious thing to be doing. and hasn't had enough attention, I don't think, on either side of politics, or there's been times when it's peaked and waned. But what are the other suggestions that you've developed in relation to countering this or dealing with the potential threat from China?
Well, the reason I called the book The Echidna Strategy is because I think the echidna is a neat metaphor of for the kind of defence force Australia should be trying to build.
Cute but spiky.
Cute but spiky, yeah. So benign to friends, but to anyone that threatens us would be spiky and indigestible, right? So when you're a middle power that's potentially up against a great power, there is not a lot to be gained from escalating a military confrontation. What you should be doing is aiming not to lose. And so the echidna helps there. It doesn't go out looking for enemies. It doesn't go out looking for predators that might threaten it. But what it can do is stop predators if they ever come towards them, right? And cause them just enough pain just to make them go away and think again.
Yep.
And that is the kind of defence force that I would be trying to build for Australia. It doesn't start with AUKUS, right? So I mean, I think that's has a hugely distortionary impact on Australian force posture. We are building a navy and now an Australian defence force that is basically, around a submarine fleet that is first and foremost designed to supplement the American fleet and to operate in conjunction with the United States. And the obvious use case for these submarines is to have them off the Chinese coast, trying to hem the Chinese Navy in along its coastline and even fire missiles onto the Chinese mainland. That, to me, should not be a core competency of the ADF. The job of the ADF is to defend Australia, defend the Australian continent, and we can do that far more easily close to our air and sea approaches, not off the Chinese coast.
Right, so you'd be supportive of the DSR flagged strategy and the measures that have been taken so far in relation to standoff capability. Basically, we certainly look defensive in nature mostly.
Absolutely. And I think that the DSR picks up really on the defence of Australia kind of strategies that were developed in the 80s, where the emphasis was on the air and maritime approaches to Australia's north. So the logic that drove that strategy is still the right one. The only way to direct significant amounts of military force at Australia is through those air and maritime approaches. So the job of the ADF should be to defend those air and maritime approaches.
Take advantage of it.
Yeah,
it's like I heard some commentator engaging against a column I wrote early on, in this Middle East conflict issue, where he said that Israel doesn't have a strategic depth problem. Whereas it took 3 minutes for Hamas to get through the fence and into the first kibbutz, whereas in Iran's ballistic missiles, they've had only a certain number that can actually reach Israel. Well, they can't get anywhere near Australia. And so, as you pointed out in your book, you're talking about a dwindling sort of volume of opportunities in terms of the volumetric impact you would need. And the capacity that isn't there for that at the moment. But so this standoff capability is definitely, I think we can all agree, is a good direction. My biggest issue with AUKUS actually was the ham-fisted diplomatic approach to it. We were basically sending this message to the world that, the old white boys colonial club's still alive and strong, rather than sort of focusing on, well, you could do all of that without making a big song and dance out of it.
Yeah.
And then prioritizing your outreach and really focusing on Talisman Sabre and things like that, in the absence of regional security architecture like Europe has with NATO, etc., to build the practical sinews and whatnot. And I think that sends a good diplomatic message to China. And all these countries in the region, 19 of them, are concerned about the way you're doing business and the lack of transparency and the aggression in the South China Seas against clear law of the sea principles and interests. You're threatening the thing that made you great, which is the strength of international trade, and those sorts of signals. Is that the sort of thrust you see as the way forward as well? Or?
Yeah, well, I'd say one point about the way AUKUS was received in the region, you're right, it was extremely secretive in its conception. In fact, in Australia, a project that I loudly oppose, I would say one of the most impressive aspects of it was the complete secrecy in which it was conceived. You know, the information security around it was
Great
truly
deception plan with the French, that's for sure.
Right. It was truly impressive, the information security around it. But that has its downsides, and one of those was in the way it was perceived in the region. And I would argue that even though this government has been a little better about that than about their briefings and so on to regional leaders, the core problem remains. And to me, the core problem that, you know, it's very hard to get Southeast Asian countries to agree on anything. One thing they all seem to agree on is that they don't want their region to become a playing field for great power competition.
Right.
That is exactly what AUKUS does, right? When Australia arms itself with these submarines, and when it also places American bombers and American submarines on Australian soil, you are giving China a direct incentive to operate in and through maritime Southeast Asia. That is exactly what the Southeast Asians have been telling us for years that they do not want.
Yes. Challenging times from all angles, obviously presenting Australia with the need to make some choices about building around the uncertainty of the US and setting up stronger relationships with NATO, building up our contacts in the region, the Quad, etc. So there's a job of work there for the government. They're going to have to be very skilled and manoeuvre through this, and we'll see whether they exhibit those skills.
Right.
But thank you so much for your contribution, Sam, because I think, to me, the most important thing and the biggest strength we have in a democracy is contestability, disputation. It's how we get to better refined product. Sometimes I used to say to my colleagues in government that, you know, you guys need a red teaming process for these legislative proposals. And the last time a green and white paper process was entered into was when we did the CPRS. And I think no government has done one since because they're afraid of having, you know, the open discussion and how it might be exploited or distorted and the political risk associated with it. But at least in this sort of space, we can take up the cudgel on that front and get that thought process and discussion going. So well done, Sam. Thanks for that.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Mike, for creating the platform.
Oh, no worries, mate. Yeah, that's our mission. And so on that point, we hope you'll like and subscribe to the program so that we can actually get that message out there, get the information out there, and to make our program sustainable in the long term. So be with us again next time for some more interesting conversations. We've got some great, equally interesting experts and deep thinkers ahead for you. So thanks, Sam. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Mike.
Cheers.